Keanu Reeves thought he'd never see the man who saved his life again, until a single sentence on live television brought his past crashing back. A letter, a silhouette in the shadows, and a truth buried for decades. What happened next made the world stop and left Keanu in tears before millions. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The studio lights dimmed softly as the audience settled into a hush, the kind that only comes before something deeply human is about to unfold. The set was designed with warmth in mind, not flashy, not overwhelming. A few potted plants, gentle amber lights, and plush gray armchairs gave the room the feel of a quiet evening living room rather than a high-precedent TV broadcast. The cameras were nearly invisible. What mattered here wasn't the spectacle. It was the soul. Then the host stepped into frame, dressed in a charcoal blazer and open-collar shirt. His presence was calm, focused, and grounded. He addressed the viewers with a tone that carried both curiosity and reverence. Tonight, we're not just talking about Hollywood. We're talking about the heart behind the fame. A soft applause greeted Keanu Reeves as he walked onto the stage. No music, no spotlight fanfare, just a quiet wave of welcome from an audience that knew they weren't meeting a celebrity tonight. They were meeting a person. Keanu wore dark jeans, a simple black t-shirt, and a worn leather jacket that looked older than some of the studio equipment. His boots clicked gently against the stage floor. He offered a shy smile and a small wave as he made his way to the armchair opposite the host. The two men shook hands, and Keanu sat, legs crossed loosely, hands resting in his lap. He looked around the studio with soft eyes, the kind of eyes that saw everything but judged nothing. "Keanu," the host began, his voice smooth but thoughtful, "thank you for being here. You've played so many roles, but tonight, we just want to meet you." Keanu smiled faintly. "That's a big question," he said quietly, "but I'll do my best." The audience chuckled softly. The first few minutes drifted through familiar territory. Questions about behind-the-scenes stories on movie sets, funny moments with co-stars, the creative process behind iconic scenes from The Matrix and John Wick. Keanu answered with his trademark humility, often shifting the spotlight away from himself and onto others. He praised directors, editors, costume designers. When the host called him one of the most admired actors of a generation, Keanu blinked slowly and said, "I just try to show up and be kind." The audience responded warmly, but the host's expression shifted ever so slightly. He closed the folder in front of him and leaned in, not aggressively, but with intention. "Keanu," he said, "we've talked about the roles you've played and the people you've met along the way, but tonight, we want to talk about something different." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Okay." The host let the pause sit for just a second longer than usual. "We want to talk about who shaped you." For the first time all evening, Keanu didn't answer right away. His gaze dropped to the floor. The shift in his posture was subtle, but unmistakable. Shoulders drawn in slightly, eyes searching for something invisible in the air. The room felt it. The audience sat up straighter, sensing a deeper story was about to begin. The silence stretched for a moment, but not uncomfortably. It was the kind of pause that comes when someone begins to travel inward, sorting through years of noise to find a single thread of truth. Keanu shifted slightly in his seat, his hands folded over one another, the left thumb gently tracing circles on the back of his right knuckle. The studio was still. "I think," he began, voice lower now, "that most of us are shaped by people who never planned to shape us. They just showed up at the right time." The host nodded gently, encouraging him to continue. "There was someone like that in my life," Keanu said. "Someone I haven't seen in decades." The audience leaned in. Every breath in the room seemed to wait for the next word. "Henry was my high school teacher," Keanu continued. Not just any teacher, he taught literature, but more than that, he taught me how to breathe when I didn't know how. His voice didn't crack, but there was weight behind every syllable. Years of memory, sorrow, and gratitude hidden in each word. He saw something in me when I didn't even see anything worth noticing. I was struggling, at home, at school, in my own head. The host watched closely, hands clasped together, his expression soft. I had trouble reading, dyslexia. The letters, they didn't stay still for me. They danced, slipped away. I couldn't keep up. Most teachers just moved on, but he didn't. Keanu's eyes lifted, not toward the host, but toward the ceiling lights above the stage. I remember one day after class, I stayed behind. Not on purpose, I was just stuck. I couldn't move. Everyone had left. And he came over, pulled up a chair, and just sat beside me. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't try to fix me. There was a long pause. Keanu's fingers stilled. He just said, "You don't have to be perfect to be important." That's all. Just that one sentence. The audience let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. "I carried that line with me," Keanu said, "through every rejection, every dark night, every time I felt like the world was too loud and I was too broken." The host leaned forward now. "Did you ever get the chance to thank him?" Keanu shook his head slowly. "No, I never did. Life moved on. I left school, started acting, moved cities, countries. He was there for a moment, a season, but I never saw him again." The host's voice dropped a note lower. "What would you say to him now, if you could?" Keanu blinked. His eyes glistened under the soft studio lights. "I'd say thank you for seeing me when I was invisible, for not needing me to be special, just needing me to exist." The room was silent, reverent, and somewhere, in the very last row of the studio, a shadow stirred. The host didn't speak right away. He allowed the weight of Keanu's words to hang in the air like morning fog, thick, unspoken, undeniable. The audience remained quiet, their expressions transformed from light entertainment to something far deeper. A few people clutched tissues. Some sat perfectly still, as if movement might disrupt the sacredness of what had just been shared. Then, with care, the host reached beneath his desk and pulled out a single card. He looked at it, then glanced toward the back of the room without giving anything away. "Keanu," he said, his tone soft, "we've invited you here not just to celebrate what you've become, but to honor where you came from." Keanu tilted his head, curious. "There's a lot of talk about legacies," the host continued. "Fame, success, influence. But tonight, we wanted to ask you not just who you are, but who made you who you are." Keanu nodded slowly, lips pressing into a thin, reflective line. "You've played heroes on screen, but off-screen there was someone who showed you what a quiet hero really looks like." Keanu didn't respond with words. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, as if silently agreeing. The host looked down again at the card, then up at the cameras. "To our viewers watching at home," he said gently, "tonight is about recognizing the invisible hands that shape great lives. The teachers, the mentors, the people who show up when no one else does. You may not know their names, but their impact is written across the stories we celebrate." The camera cut back to Keanu, who sat quietly, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "We never forgot him," he said at last. "Even when I was doing press tours or learning fight choreography, part of me was still that kid in the classroom, trying to read the same line over and over again, while everyone else laughed. And he didn't laugh. He stayed." The host's voice lowered one more octave. "We have something for you tonight, but before we go there, I want to ask you one last question." Keanu looked up, attentive. "Do you remember what he looked like?" A silence. Then, softly, Keanu began to describe him. Tall, slim, always holding a book. He had this half-smile, like he knew something about the world, but didn't need to prove it, and he laughed. Quietly. He made you feel calm just by standing near you, like he didn't need you to perform, he just needed you to stay alive. The host nodded slowly. Sometimes. That's all it takes to save someone. Keanu gave a small nod. The lights in the studio dimmed slightly, just enough to shift the atmosphere. Then, almost imperceptibly, a soft spotlight brushed over the last row of the studio audience. A man sat there, still and waiting. Unannounced, unnamed, but Keanu's eyes widened, and everything in him seemed to recognize the shape of a memory coming to life. The host leaned forward slightly, elbows resting gently on his knees, voice lowered to a near whisper, as if he didn't want to break whatever sacred space had just unfolded between them. Was there someone, he asked carefully, before all of this? Before the lights and the roles and the world knowing your name? Someone who changed the trajectory of your life? Keanu looked down at his lap, silent for a few long seconds. His jaw tightened, then relaxed. A breath slipped from his lips. Yes, he said simply. The audience remained still. The weight of that single word echoed with more power than any long answer could have. The host waited. He knew better than to rush a memory that had been buried under decades of experience. Keanu's voice came again, quiet but anchored. My high school literature teacher. He didn't offer the name, not yet, but something about the way he said teacher made it feel more like a title than a profession. Not just someone who taught, someone who saw. Impulse didn't just assign books, Keanu continued. He taught me how to see myself, when I didn't even know where to look. The host nodded, encouraging. At the time, I was lost, Keanu said. Really lost. My father had vanished years earlier, just gone. No goodbye, no note. And my mother? She was trying, she was doing her best, but we moved a lot. Nothing ever felt still. Nothing ever felt safe. He looked up, his gaze not fixed on anything in particular, more like he was seeing through time. My sister had just started getting sick. We didn't know what it was, but the hospital visits were increasing. I was about 16. I couldn't focus, couldn't read. Letters didn't stay still on the page. I had dyslexia, but no one called it that back then. They just said I was lazy or slow. The host's expression softened, and a few people in the audience shifted in their seats, visibly moved. I felt like a mistake, Keanu said. Everything about me felt wrong. I couldn't read aloud without stuttering. I hated school, hated being seen. I wanted to disappear. He paused, then added, but he didn't let me. The host asked, your teacher? Keanu nodded. He sat with me after class, not every day, just when he saw it was too much. He didn't lecture, he didn't judge. He just made space for me to exist without shame. Another pause. He taught me about literature, sure, but really he taught me what it meant to have worth that wasn't attached to performance. The host leaned in. That's a rare gift. Keanu gave a small, grateful smile. It saved me, he said. He saved me. The host gently asked, do you remember his name? Keanu opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes flicked downward again. I do, he said after a pause. But I haven't said it aloud in a long time. Another quiet moment passed before he added, Mr. Whitmore. The name settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples reached everyone. I don't know where he is now, Keanu continued, or if he's even still alive. I've wondered from time to time, but I never saw him again after graduation. The host asked gently, did you ever try to reach out? Keanu shook his head. No, and that's one of the things I regret most. He folded his hands together, pressing his thumbs tight against each other. You go on with life, you chase dreams, you move cities, you change everything, but you forget to look back at the people who helped you start. The host looked at him with quiet understanding. Keanu continued, "There were days when I truly didn't want to go on, when I felt like the world was better off without me. But he saw something. He called it presence. I didn't understand it at the time. I just thought he was being nice." The host's tone softened. "But it meant something to you." "It meant everything," Keanu said. "One day, he pulled me aside and said, 'You don't have to be loud to be powerful.' And that line, it lived in me. Even now, on the toughest days, I hear that in my head." The audience was fully silent, many visibly emotional. Keanu leaned back slightly, eyes misty but not falling. He seemed to be holding something steady within himself. "He believed in me before I could believe in anything," he said. "Not because of talent. I didn't even know I had any. But because he saw I was trying." He looked out across the studio, not realizing his gaze was drifting toward the very seat where the silhouette sat in stillness. The host waited, then said, "He sounds like someone who left more than just lessons behind." Keanu nodded. "He left a light, a way forward." Then, with a quieter voice, more vulnerable than before, he added, "I just wish I had told him, thanked him, even once." The camera held his face as he said it. The regret in his tone wasn't loud or dramatic. It was simple, honest, and deep. The host didn't respond right away, but behind him, in the very last row of the studio, the figure sat a little straighter. Still unseen by Keanu, still unnamed, but listening. The host folded his hands, took a breath, and spoke with care. "Keanu, there are moments in life we never forget. Sometimes they're wrapped in words, other times in silence. Do you remember the last time you saw him?" Keanu exhaled slowly, his memory drawing itself forward like a thread from a distant spool. "It was after our final school performance. He'd cast me in the lead role. I still don't know why. I could barely speak in front of people without trembling. But he insisted, said the role wasn't about acting, it was about being." He paused, eyes beginning to shimmer again. "I remember he walked up to me backstage. The lights were still warm and I was sweating from nerves. He handed me a small, folded piece of paper and said, 'This is for when you forget who you are.' Then he smiled, turned, and walked away." The host leaned in gently. "Do you still have it?" Keanu nodded, slowly reaching into his inner coat pocket. From within, he carefully pulled out a folded square of yellowed paper. The edges were worn, the creases delicate from time and travel. "I've kept it ever since," he said softly. "I never told anyone, not until now." The host asked, "What did it say?" Keanu unfolded it with trembling hands, glancing at the words before whispering them aloud. "Even silence has a sound, Keanu. Listen to your soul before the world drowns it out." The words settled into the room like a prayer. The audience sat breathless. "That line got me through more than I can say," Keanu added. "When I lost people, when I couldn't find work, when I felt like the noise was too much, I would read this. And somehow, I could keep going." The host nodded, visibly moved. "And he gave that to you without asking for anything in return." Keanu looked toward the floor. "I never told him it worked. I never told him he changed my life. That line, that note, it helped me survive." He paused, then whispered, "I don't even know if he ever knew how much it mattered." The host allowed the moment to linger, then glanced, just briefly, toward the back of the room. "Keanu," he said, his voice measured and deliberate, "sometimes the people we believe are long gone are still closer than we think." Keanu looked up, slightly puzzled. The host gave a soft, enigmatic smile. "What if he heard every word you just said?" Keanu's brow furrowed. He followed the host's line of sight toward the farthest row. His breath caught. There, in the dim lighting of the final row, sat a man with white hair, back straight, hands folded, watching. Still unnamed, but unmistakably known. And Keanu's world, tilted quietly on its axis. Keanu's eyes stayed locked on the faint silhouette in the back row, his breath suspended, as though his body had momentarily forgotten how to move. The host, sensing the fragile weight of the moment, gave him a moment before gently bringing the conversation back into focus. "Keanu," the host said softly, "a few moments ago, you shared something deeply personal, a quote that stayed with you all these years. Would you be willing to share it with us now?" Keanu looked away from the silhouette, gathering himself. He nodded slowly. "There was a day," he began, voice low and even, "when I broke down in front of the entire class. We were reading Shakespeare out loud. The words blurred. I stumbled over them, mixed them up. My throat tightened. The other kids started laughing." His lips pressed together tightly before he continued. "I felt humiliated. I couldn't even get through a sentence. I wanted to run, to disappear. I was shaking so badly I dropped the book." The audience listened in total stillness. "Everyone was still laughing," Keanu said. "Everyone but him." He paused and looked at the floor. Mr. Whitmore picked up the book, set it on my desk, and said, "You don't have to be perfect to be important." There was a quiet murmur in the crowd. Someone wiped a tear. A few people reached for tissues without looking away. Keanu looked up again. "That line, it didn't fix everything, but it gave me a way to keep going." The host nodded. "It gave you permission." Keanu nodded back. "Permission to exist. Permission to try." That sentence kept me from quitting, from giving up entirely. There were nights when I couldn't sleep, days when I didn't want to leave my room. And that sentence, those 9 words, they became like a hand on my shoulder, reminding me that I didn't have to earn my right to be here. His voice cracked slightly on the last phrase, but he held himself together. I've carried that line with me through every dark chapter, and the strange thing is, I don't think he ever knew it. The host leaned over and opened the drawer beside him. "Well," he said, "maybe it's time he did." Keanu looked over, confused. The host reached inside and pulled out a single cream-colored envelope, its edges softened by age. There was no label, no return address. Just careful, delicate handwriting across the front. 4KR, only when he's ready. Keanu stared at the envelope in the host's hand, eyes fixed on the writing like it was a ghost made real. His body leaned forward slightly, unconsciously pulled by something deeper than memory. The host held it out with both hands, reverent, as though what it contained wasn't just paper, but something sacred. Keanu took it gently. His fingers ran across the handwriting, slow, deliberate. His voice lowered to almost a whisper. "This is his," he said. "I know it. The way the R is curved, the way he used to sign homework comments." The audience was frozen. The cameras captured his trembling hands as he carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded page, neatly creased, pale with time but untouched by dust. Keanu opened it. His eyes scanned the words once, then again, slower. The silence in the studio thickened. He looked up, breath unsteady, and then read aloud. "Even silence has a sound, Keanu. Listen to your soul before the world drowns it out. You're not lost. You're learning how to hear." A hush fell over the audience. No one moved. No one whispered. The only sound in the room was the subtle shift of Keanu's breath as he pressed the letter gently against his chest. "That's his voice," Keanu said softly. "That's the way he wrote, the way he spoke. I'd forgotten the rhythm of it until now." The host's eyes were glassy. He asked gently, "Do you remember the first time he said something like that to you?" Keanu nodded slowly. "It was after that reading, the day I stuttered through every line of Macbeth. Everyone was laughing. I remember standing in the hallway afterward, trying to disappear into the wall." He looked up, eyes distant but focused on the memory. Hal walked up beside me. Didn't say anything at first, just stood there, like he was giving me space to be angry or embarrassed or whatever I needed. Keanu's voice steadied, anchored in the story. Then he said, "What you read today wasn't Shakespeare. It was bravery. And bravery doesn't need perfect words." He smiled faintly through the emotion. I didn't understand it at the time, but I do now. He wasn't talking about the reading. He was talking about me. The host let the moment breathe before saying, "You've spent your life speaking through silence, through stillness, through presence. And maybe that's because someone once told you that it was enough just to be." Keanu nodded again. "I've never forgotten that. Even when everything else fell apart, that stayed." He unfolded the letter again, holding it up as though letting the light run through it. "This," he said, "is the reason I'm still here." Keanu held the letter open on his lap, his fingers resting gently on the edges like it was something fragile and alive. He looked at the words once more, then folded the paper with quiet care and slipped it back into the envelope. The host waited, allowing Keanu the space to breathe, to collect what decades had buried. Then, softly, he asked, "What does it mean to you now, hearing those words again? Not just remembering them, but holding them in your hands." Keanu looked up, his eyes full but steady. "It's proof," he said, "that something I thought had faded was actually waiting for me." He paused for a moment, then added, "When you're young and hurting and someone tells you that you matter, you don't always believe it, but if they tell you enough times, sometimes the echo lasts." The host leaned in slightly. "And this letter?" Keanu gave a faint smile, a tear finally escaping and trailing down his cheek. "This letter is the echo," he said. "Still here, still speaking, still believing in me." There was a long moment of silence. The audience remained still, many holding their breath, their eyes red from emotion. Some reached for tissues, others simply stared, deeply moved. The host glanced again toward the back row of the audience, where the figure remained seated, still silent. "Keanu," the host said quietly, "it's clear your teacher left a mark on you, a sentence that shaped everything." Keanu nodded slowly. "I used to think strength was loud, big, unshakable," he said. "But that sentence, 'You don't have to be perfect to be important,' it taught me that being gentle doesn't mean being weak, that showing up with all your flaws still matters." The host asked, "Do you think that's why your characters resonate so deeply, because of that quiet truth?" Keanu took a deep breath, as if considering that question for the first time. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe because I've spent my whole life trying to be someone who reminds others what Mr. Whitmore reminded me." The host folded his hands. "And now," he said gently, "you may finally have the chance to say something back." Keanu turned his head, slowly, deliberately. His eyes scanned the rows of audience members, then stopped. The silhouette in the final row remained still. But the presence, it wasn't just a figure in shadow anymore. It was gravity. Familiar, heavy with unspoken recognition. Keanu didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His eyes filled again, his chest rose and fell, because deep in the quiet of that studio, the student had spoken, and somewhere in the silence, the teacher had answered. Keanu sat motionless, the envelope resting in his lap. His fingers hovered over it, the edges just barely brushing his skin, as if opening it too quickly might undo something sacred. Around him, the studio held its breath. No cameras moved, no one in the audience stirred. It was as though time itself had slowed to honor the weight of this moment. He finally brought the envelope closer, resting it against his chest for a long second. Then, with trembling hands, he began to peel it open. The seal was delicate but intact, the paper soft from age, yet uncreased until now. He pulled out a small single sheet, no longer than a postcard, folded once down the middle. The handwriting struck him immediately. Familiar, intimate. A script he hadn't seen in decades, yet could recognize with absolute certainty. He didn't read it right away. Instead, he looked at it as one might look at an old photograph of someone they had lost, long before they were ready to say goodbye. "This is his," Keanu whispered. This is his voice." He looked up, but not at the host. His eyes seemed to search the far edges of the studio, scanning the faces in the audience, stopping somewhere near the shadows beyond the last row. Then, without warning, his voice found strength. He read the letter aloud, slowly, letting each word land. "Even silence has a sound, Keanu. You are not lost. You are learning how to hear." He stopped. The silence in the room was now almost physical. You could feel it pressing into the walls, into the skin, into the breath of every person present. Keanu lowered the note and placed it gently against his heart. "This is from him," he said again, louder this time, as if needing the room to witness it. "I don't know how it got here. I don't know who brought it. But this is his voice. I'd know it anywhere." The host was quiet for a moment, then spoke with deliberate calm. "Keanu, there's more to this moment than you realize." Keanu's eyebrows pulled together slightly, confused but not alarmed. He looked back toward the host, who was no longer holding any papers or props. His hands were resting quietly on his lap, his eyes glancing toward the rear of the studio. Not urgently, but purposefully. Keanu followed his gaze. The camera, almost imperceptibly, shifted its angle. Not with drama, not with orchestration. Just enough to capture what the audience had already noticed. There, in the last row of the studio, sat a man with white hair, shoulders straight, hands folded carefully in his lap. Still unnamed, still silent, but unmistakably present. Keanu didn't blink, his gaze locked on the man in the final row. He didn't move, he didn't speak. But something in him changed. His breath caught in his chest, his fingers tightened around the letter. The man didn't wave, he didn't smile, he didn't even lean forward. But it didn't matter. Because presence, real presence, doesn't need a name or an introduction. The host waited a beat, then asked softly, "Do you recognize him?" Keanu didn't answer right away. His lips parted, but no sound came. His head tilted just slightly, the way a child might look at someone from long ago. He wasn't sure if he was seeing a memory or a man, but his body knew before his words did. I don't know," he whispered, "but something in me does." He turned the letter over in his hand, looking again at the handwriting, at the ink pressed into the paper like fingerprints frozen in time. Then he looked back toward the figure in the last row. "I remember the way he used to sit," Keanu said, voice shaking, back straight, always still, hands folded like that. The host nodded gently. "Sometimes the body remembers what the mind hasn't caught up to yet." Keanu nodded slowly, still staring. "When I was a kid, I thought silence was the same as absence," he said. "When someone didn't speak, I thought they were ignoring me. But Mr. Whitmore, he taught me that silence could mean something else." The host leaned in, his voice softer. "What did it mean to you?" Keanu looked down, letting the question linger. "It meant safety," he answered. "It meant that I didn't have to perform. I didn't have to explain. I could just exist, and that was enough." The audience stayed frozen, many in tears, completely transfixed by the unfolding moment. "El never rushed me," Keanu continued. "He never pushed. He just made space. And that letter, these words, it feels like he's still making space, even now." The host looked once again toward the silhouette. "We don't always get to thank the people who save us," he said. "But every now and then, the universe gives us a second chance." Keanu turned fully in his chair, no longer facing the cameras or the stage, but the back of the room. He didn't stand. He didn't speak, but everything in him was reaching. His fingers, still clutching the letter, trembled in his lap. And the man in the final row, the one with the white hair and steady hands, remained exactly where he was. Still, waiting, watching, and for the first time in a lifetime, seen. Keanu didn't take his eyes off the man. His face was soft now, no longer tense, no longer unsure, just still, as though something deep inside had settled. A quiet certainty, not of memory, but of meaning. The host remained silent, allowing the stillness to speak louder than words. The letter in Keanu's lap looked small now, but the weight it carried had filled the entire room. "This sentence," Keanu said at last, voice low. "It came to me in moments when I had nothing left. When I thought I'd lost my sister, when a roll slipped through my fingers, when I sat in the dark thinking no one would ever understand me." He glanced down at the words again. Even silence has a sound. He looked up toward the back row once more. "That line told me my silence wasn't shameful. It was sacred. It was me listening before I knew how to speak." There were no lights flashing, no dramatic music, just the quiet rhythm of a man rediscovering something he didn't even know he'd lost. Keanu turned slightly in his chair, not toward the cameras, not toward the host, but fully toward the man in the shadows. "If that's him," he whispered, "and I believe it is." He paused. "Then I want him to know I heard every lesson, every silence, every truth he never forced me to accept, but gently left behind for me to find when I was ready." The host watched with reverence. The audience was frozen, many wiping tears from their cheeks, others simply watching through blurred vision. "Saw me," Keanu continued, "when I didn't even see myself. Not the actor, not the name, just the boy, the one hiding behind silence and half-spoken sentences." He held the letter once more, this time not for strength but as offering. "And now I see him." The host finally spoke again, voice soft as dusk. "Some moments don't need explanation. They just need to arrive. And this one, it's arrived." Keanu nodded slowly, blinking back tears. "I spent my whole life trying to become the kind of man who could make someone else feel seen, the way he made me feel seen." He looked back at the figure one final time, his voice steadier than before. "I don't know why he came tonight. I don't know how this letter found its way into my hands. But I do know that some debts aren't measured in money or favors. They're measured in becoming." His eyes never left the last row. And though the man still hadn't spoken, hadn't moved, hadn't claimed his name, his presence said everything. Because when a teacher changes a life without ever needing credit, sometimes just being there, quiet, watching, waiting, is the loudest thank you ever spoken. The host sat back slightly in his chair, his expression calm but purposeful. His next question came not with force, but with depth. "Keanu," he said, "we've talked a lot about who you became, but who were you before all this? Before the strength, before the fame, before the armor?" Keanu exhaled slowly, his posture softening. "I was a broken kid," he said. "Angry, quiet, scared." The words didn't feel rehearsed. They landed gently, each one chipped from a deeper place. "I moved around a lot as a child. My family never really settled. My father left when I was young and there wasn't any closure, just absence. That kind of wound. It doesn't bleed, it echoes." He paused, eyes flicking to the floor before rising again. "My mother did what she could, but she worked a lot. My sister was already starting to get sick around that time. No one really knew what was wrong yet, but I could feel the weight in the house." He took a breath, then added, "School was the only place I had structure. But it didn't feel safe. I couldn't read well. The letters danced on the page, scrambled themselves. Other kids laughed. Teachers moved on. I became invisible. On purpose." The host's voice came gently. "Did anyone see you?" Keanu nodded. "Mr. Whitmore." His eyes softened with the memory. "There was a day I skipped lunch. I was tired of pretending to be fine. I went back to the classroom, sat at a desk in the corner just staring out the window. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just sat there." He paused, remembering. Mr. Whitmore walked in. He saw me, but he didn't say a word. He didn't ask questions. He just pulled a chair next to mine and sat down. The studio remained silent, every heart drawn to the quiet power in that moment. "We didn't talk," Keanu said. "Not for 5 minutes. Not for 10. Just sat there in silence, and somehow, that made me feel more understood than anything anyone had ever said." He looked at the host. He made my silence feel safe, not shameful. The host nodded, visibly moved. "That's the moment," Keanu added, "when I started to believe that maybe I wasn't broken, just quiet. And maybe quiet didn't mean I had nothing to say." He glanced down, hands folded, voice lowering. A few weeks later, he gave us an assignment to write a personal essay. He said, "You don't have to impress anyone, just be honest." The host's eyes brightened slightly. Keanu nodded. It was the first time I ever tried to express what I was feeling. I didn't even know if it made sense, but I poured everything into it. The host looked toward his desk, fingers grazing something hidden just beneath the surface. "Keanu," he said carefully, "that essay might not be lost." Keanu looked up slowly, eyes narrowing with a hint of disbelief. His voice was cautious, unsure whether to hope or retreat. "You have it?" he asked quietly. The host didn't answer right away. Instead, he tapped the edge of the desk gently, then looked toward the control booth. A quiet cue passed between them. A producer offstage stepped forward and carefully handed something to the host. It was a small file folder, worn, thin, the kind that held forgotten essays or abandoned school papers. Nothing glamorous, just the kind of object time usually erases. The host placed it gently on the table between them. He slid it toward Keanu without speaking. Keanu reached forward with deliberate care. His hands hovered over it for a moment, as if afraid that opening it might change something inside him. When he finally opened the flap, he saw a single sheet of lined paper, aged but intact, with faint pencil marks still visible through the years. The handwriting was his. He stared. This was mine," he whispered. "I remember the paper, the fold, the way I pressed so hard on the pencil because I was nervous it would fade before anyone ever read it." The audience sat breathless as Keanu gently lifted the paper out. He scanned the title and blinked slowly. "Where I Grow Up, I Want to Make Pain Smaller." His lips parted, but for a long moment, no words came, just memory. "I wrote this after my sister had another hospital stay," he said softly. "She was so pale, so tired, and I felt so helpless. I didn't know how to say it to anyone, so I wrote this instead." The host watched with quiet reverence. Keanu began reading the first lines aloud, his voice steady but low. "I want to be someone who understands people, even when they can't say what hurts. I don't think I'll be famous, but I want to be kind. I want to be the kind of person who makes a room feel safer." He stopped, overcome. His fingers trembled slightly. Then he folded the page again with the same care he had when he was a teenager. "That was the first time I ever told the truth out loud," he said, "even if it was only on paper." The host asked softly, "Do you remember what Mr. Whitmore said about it?" Keanu nodded, smiling faintly. And great, it didn't mark it up. He just wrote one sentence at the bottom, "I see you." The audience exhaled as one. A moment of stillness passed between every heart in the room. "Eric never returned the paper," Keanu continued. "I thought maybe it got lost." He looked down at it again, but he kept it all these years. The host gave a knowing glance toward the final row of the audience, where the silhouette remained still, watching, waiting. Keanu stared at the folded page in his hands like it was something fragile and holy. His thumbs pressed gently along the creases, as if his fingers could feel the years between who he was then and who he is now. "I never thought anyone would keep this," he said. "Not even me." He looked up again, but his eyes didn't go to the host. They searched for the man still seated in the back row, that still, wordless figure whose presence had hovered over every moment like an old song you remember without realizing you're humming. "Hell saw through everything I was pretending to be," Keanu continued. "The quiet kid, the angry kid, the one who acted like he didn't care because caring always hurt." The host leaned forward gently. "Maybe he kept it," he said, "because he knew that one day, when the world finally saw you, you'd need to remember who you really were before they told you who to be." Keanu nodded slowly. "I used to think becoming someone meant leaving the past behind, but the truth is, I've spent my whole life trying to become the person who wrote this page." He unfolded the essay once more. The corners were soft, the pencil faint, but the words were still legible. "I want to be someone who makes pain smaller." His voice trembled. "I didn't even know what that meant when I wrote it. I just knew I never wanted anyone to feel the way I felt in that moment, helpless, unseen, drowning in silence." The host gave him a moment before asking, "Do you think he knew, back then?" Keanu glanced again toward the man in the back row. "I think he saw it before I did," he said. "And I think he believed it would survive inside me, even if I forgot for a while." The host smiled gently. "You've become the echo of those words, Keanu." He paused, then added, "And somehow he knew you would." Keanu looked down again at the note and the essay, one written by the mentor, the other by the boy. Two voices across time, speaking the same language of quiet truth. "I used to think my silence was a weakness," he said, "but now I know it was a language, and he was the first person who ever listened." He folded the essay once more and placed it beside the letter. "Before the movies, before the red carpets, before the armor, I was just a scared, silent kid trying to survive." He looked once more at the shadowed man in the final row, and he made that silence sacred. The audience sat in reverent quiet, many wiping away tears. Because sometimes the most powerful moments aren't the loud ones. They're the ones where nothing needs to be said, because the truth has already been heard. Keanu took a breath, his voice gentler now, more vulnerable than before. "There was this one day," he said, "just a few weeks after I turned in that essay. Mr. Whitmore came into class with a big announcement. He said we were going to be putting on a play." He paused, eyes drifting upward as though watching it all unfold again in the back of his mind. Heavy said we'd be doing The Crucible, heavy stuff for high school, and he needed someone to play John Proctor. The host tilted his head slightly. "That's a big role." Keanu smiled faintly. "Exactly. And I assumed he'd cast one of the outgoing kids, the ones who read smoothly, who always raise their hands. I didn't even audition. I didn't think I was even on the list." He leaned forward slightly. "But after class, he stopped me in the hallway. He put a script in my hands and said, 'You're my proctor.'" The host looked surprised. "Just like that?" Keanu nodded. "Just like that." His smile faded a little as emotion crept into his voice. I said, "But I can't even read without stuttering. I'll ruin it." And he just looked at me and said, "You don't need to speak perfectly. You just need to be seen." The room was silent again, the words hanging like truth cut into glass. "And believed in the version of me I hadn't even met yet," Keanu said softly, "the one buried under all the fear and shame." He paused, then added, "It made no sense. I could barely breathe in front of a crowd, let alone perform." But he said it wasn't about saying lines, it was about presence. The host leaned in. "That's the thing about real mentors, isn't it? They don't just teach, they prophesy. Keanu's head tilted slightly. What do you mean? Bailey, don't just see what you are, the host said. They see what you could become, and they speak to that person before you even know he exists. Keanu blinked slowly. His lips parted, but he didn't speak right away. It was as if that idea, so simple, landed somewhere new inside him. That's exactly what it felt like, he finally said. Like he was talking to someone I hadn't grown into yet, and I trusted him more than I trusted my own reflection. The host gave him time. The weight of the story settled over the studio. Keanu turned his head again, eyes scanning the back row. The figure was still there, still silent, still seated, still waiting. But now the audience was starting to understand. The stillness wasn't just quiet. It was intention. It was love, held in restraint. It was belief, waiting for recognition. Keanu took another breath, as though drawing strength from the very memory. Rehearsals were a disaster, he said with a laugh that carried both nostalgia and pain. I froze during the first read-through. Couldn't get through 3 sentences without choking on the words. My hands shook, my knees locked. I thought he'd replace me. He glanced toward the host, but he didn't. The host's voice was quiet. What did he do? Keanu's smile faded into something softer. Manhattan just pulled me aside and said, Keanu, courage doesn't mean being loud. It means staying still when every part of you wants to run. The audience stirred. A few people wiped their eyes. The moment was simple, but its truth rippled through the room. Keanu continued. He gave me time. He gave me space. He let me fail without shame. He let me stutter through rehearsals without ever questioning his decision. He looked down at his hands. And I started to believe, not that I was good at it, but that I was allowed to try. The host asked, Do you remember opening night? Keanu nodded. I almost didn't go on. I was in the back hallway, pacing. Everyone else was in costume, ready. I was sweating through mine. He paused, then added, and then Mr. Whitmore appeared, just like that. No words, just walked up to me and handed me something. The host leaned in slightly. What was it? A folded piece of paper, Keanu said. No envelope, just one sentence written on it. He reached into his jacket slowly, carefully, and pulled out a second small folded note. The paper was even older than the first, thinner, frayed at the corners. I've had this for over 30 years, Keanu said. He unfolded it gently and read aloud. Family don't need to believe in you tonight. You just need to believe in yourself once. The audience listened, spellbound. That's all it said, Keanu whispered. But it was enough. The host nodded. Because someone had already believed in you first. Keanu's eyes began to water again. I stepped out onto that stage and forgot half my lines. But I didn't leave. I stayed. And I felt something shift inside me. Not because I did well. I didn't. But because I didn't run. He folded the note again and held it close. That night changed my life. Not because of the play, but because someone chose to see something in me and waited patiently while I learned to see it too. The host turned once more toward the figure in the final row, the silhouette still seated in silence. And now the whole room knew. This wasn't a stranger watching from the dark. It was the man who first lit the fire and never let it go out. Keanu's voice softened further, as though the memories themselves were a refuge against a world that had once felt too cruel. He sat back, eyes moist yet determined, as he continued. That play wasn't just a performance. It was a declaration, a moment when I realized I wasn't meant to hide behind my failures. I was meant to be seen, for all my flaws and all my unfinished lines. He paused, glancing at the host as if seeking affirmation. The host's steady, compassionate gaze gave him the courage to press on. I remember standing on that stage, the bright lights focused on me, and feeling every insecure heartbeat echo in the silence. And then, I saw him in the wings, a fleeting glimpse of a familiar figure. For a moment, I was certain he was there to watch, to silently cheer me on as I fumbled every word. Even though I stumbled, something in me shifted. It was as if his unwavering belief permeated the air, filling me with a strength I had never known. Keanu's eyes shimmered with memories that were both tender and painful. I used to think that the roles I played on screen were the only parts of me worth seeing. But it wasn't the applause nor the lights that mattered most. It was the quiet moments backstage. The nod of understanding from a mentor who saw beyond the actor into the boy who once trembled in a classroom. He gave me a chance, one chance that redefined my entire world. He believed in me when I couldn't even muster the courage to speak out, when every attempt felt like a battle against my own doubt. The host's voice, soft and reflective, interjected, "Real mentors don't merely impart lessons, they illuminate the path for us when we are lost in the dark. They prophesy our potential before we can see it ourselves." Keanu inhaled deeply, as if drawing strength from that very notion. I carried his words with me long after the curtains fell that night. Every time I stepped into a scene, every time I hesitated at the edges of my fears, I remembered his belief. I remembered that his gift was not simply a role in a school play, but a glimpse of what I could become, a version of myself I had never dared to imagine. He turned his gaze slowly towards the back of the studio. The man with the white hair, silent yet imposing, had remained an enduring presence throughout the conversation. "It wasn't just about playing a part," Keanu continued, voice steady yet tender. "It was about learning to stand in my own truth, to let my presence speak louder than my insecurities. Because of him, I learned that being visible isn't about perfection, it's about authenticity. He made me realize that the light in us isn't measured by flawless execution, but by the courage to be imperfect, to show up, even when the world demands perfection." The host's eyes softened with understanding. "And it is that authenticity that now reaches millions, not just in film, but in the way you live your life." Keanu nodded, a quiet smile touching his lips, as he added, "In every moment I've ever hesitated, I now find the echo of his belief, a constant reminder that I was seen long before I learned to see myself." The host's gaze lingered on Keanu for a moment, as if weighing the next words carefully. Then, in a voice even softer than before, he asked, "Keanu, can I tell you something you may not know?" Keanu's brow furrowed slightly. He nodded, unsure, but open. The host took a breath, his tone shifting into something more intimate. "During the year Mr. Whitmore cast you in that school play, during the very season he was pouring encouragement into you, he was going through something of his own." Keanu leaned in slightly, confused. "What do you mean?" The host looked down at the folder in front of him, opened it briefly, then closed it again. He chose his next words slowly, with precision and care. His wife, Marianne Whitmore, passed away that same fall. She had been battling cancer for nearly 2 years, but she died just a few weeks before your first rehearsal. The room froze. Keanu didn't move. His eyes widened slowly as the words settled into him, one by one. "No," he said softly. "No, that can't be right." The host nodded gently. "It's true. She passed away quietly. He took only 3 days off before returning to work. No announcements, no sympathy cards. No one knew, except the school principal." Keanu sat back slowly in his chair, stunned. "I never said anything," Keanu whispered. "Not once. He smiled. He helped. He stayed late for rehearsals. He talked to me like nothing was wrong." The host's voice remained calm but firm. "Sometimes the ones who save us are quietly bleeding themselves." Keanu's eyes welled up. He pressed his lips together, his throat tightening. "I had no idea," he said. "None." He turned toward the shadowed man in the back row. The figure remained still, head lowered slightly, hands folded exactly the same way as before. But something in the air had shifted. Keanu's hand moved toward his jacket, pulling out the folded note again, the one with the words that had anchored him for years. Even silence has a sound. You are not lost. You are learning how to hear. His hand shook slightly as he held it. Hamilton wrote this for me, while he was burying the person he loved most. The words trembled out of him like something sacred had just been uncovered. "Helen, just give me encouragement," Keanu whispered. He gave me a future, while his world was falling apart. The audience was still, moved beyond words, and in that heavy silence, something deeper than sympathy filled the room. It was reverence. It was grief meeting gratitude. And it was the unbearable beauty of knowing someone had lifted you up at the exact moment they were collapsing quietly beneath the weight of their own sorrow. Keanu sat in silence, the folded letter pressed to his chest like a fragile heartbeat. His eyes remained fixed on the figure in the back row. He didn't blink. He barely breathed. The host gave him space, letting the weight of the revelation settle in its own time. "I always thought he was just calm by nature," Keanu said finally, his voice cracking. "The way he carried himself, his gentleness, the way he never raised his voice, I never realized maybe he was grieving the whole time." The host nodded. "And still, he showed up for you. Every day." Keanu closed his eyes. A tear escaped and ran down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. "I would have understood if he'd withdrawn," Keanu whispered. "If he'd stopped coming to rehearsals, if he had snapped at us, if he had disappeared for a while, he would have had every right." The host's voice was barely audible. "But he didn't." "No," Keanu said. "He didn't. He showed up and made me feel like I was the most important person in the room, like I mattered, and all the while he was losing the most important person in his life." He looked down, his hands trembling slightly as they held the paper. "That makes what he did sacred." The host sat quietly with those words, honoring the truth they carried. "You know," Keanu said softly, "I remember one rehearsal. It was raining hard. Everyone else had gone home. I was having trouble with a monologue, and I stayed late to get it right. He stayed with me, never looked at the clock, just sat in the front row and listened." He took a shaky breath. "I didn't know that. Might have been one of the first nights he came back to an empty house." The audience was silent. A few quiet sobs could be heard. Keanu turned slightly toward the figure again. "I wish I had known," he said. I don't know. I would have said something. I would have shown up for him somehow. But I was too lost in my own fear to see his pain." The host leaned forward gently. "You didn't know, because he didn't let you. That was his gift. He chose to carry his grief so you could learn to carry your future." Keanu's head dipped forward. He nodded slowly. "I thought he saved me with his kindness," he whispered. "But now I realize he saved me with his sacrifice." He gripped the letter tighter. "And I never said thank you." Keanu sat in silence for a long moment, holding the folded letter with both hands, as though afraid it might vanish if he let go. He didn't speak right away. His eyes were wet but focused. His shoulders were no longer drawn inward like before. They'd lowered, not in defeat, but in reverence. He looked out at the audience, then back at the silhouette in the last row. "I don't know how he did it," Keanu said softly. "How someone can carry that much pain and still choose to pour love into someone else. I was just a kid. I didn't bring anything to him. I wasn't special. I wasn't brave or smart or talented. I was scared and quiet. But he gave anyway." The host sat motionless, listening. Hell gave his time, his attention, his belief, his patience. While his world was crumbling, he gave me solid ground to stand on. And I never saw it. I didn't ask what he was going through. I didn't even know to ask. The host finally spoke, gently. "That's what love looks like, Keanu. The quiet kind. the kind that gives without asking for recognition, the kind that holds you steady while it's falling apart in silence. Keanu looked down again at the folded page. His thumbs moved over the crease like he was tracing something sacred into memory. I used to think strength was about control, about holding everything together and showing no weakness. But he taught me something different. He showed me that true strength is giving while you're hurting, showing up when no one knows what you're carrying. He took a breath, voice trembling but steady. And now, all these years later, I see it. I see what he gave me. Not just encouragement, not just words. He gave me a part of himself, a part he didn't have to give. The audience remained silent, deeply moved. The stillness wasn't empty, it was full. Of respect, of understanding, of something too deep for applause. Keanu turned toward the back of the studio once more. Maybe he gave me a future while his own heart was breaking. Another tear slipped down his face. This one he let fall freely. I would have understood if he'd closed himself off, if he'd chosen distance, but instead, he opened a door. For me, for someone he didn't owe anything to. The host nodded slowly, voice low. And that's the moment we all live for, isn't it? Not the spotlight, not the success, but the memory of someone who lifted us when we didn't even know we were falling. Keanu closed his eyes for a second, pressed the letter to his chest once more, then looked back toward the figure seated in the shadows. The silence wrapped around the studio again, reverent, because sometimes the greatest act of love is simply showing up for someone else, even when you're the one who needs saving. The host leaned forward once more, voice gentle and unwavering. Keanu, he said softly, if Mr. Whitmore were here right now, sitting in this very room, listening to everything you've just shared, what would you want to say to him? Keanu didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands, then slowly toward the silhouette still seated in the last row. The studio remained silent. The lights, the cameras, even the audience seemed to wait with breath held. I'd say, Keanu began slowly, thank you. His voice cracked slightly. Thank you for seeing me when I didn't want to be seen, for listening to the things I couldn't say out loud, for giving me the one thing I didn't even know I needed. He paused, his voice tight with emotion. You gave me myself. He looked up directly at the host. That may sound dramatic, but when you're 16, lost, invisible, and broken, and someone looks at you and says, you matter, not with a speech, not with big gestures, but with a calm presence, it changes you. It rebuilds you, slowly, quietly, from the inside out. The host gave a small nod. Sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that never raise their volume. Keanu let those words settle before continuing. Eloise Alta didn't try to fix me. He didn't tell me to be strong or to get over anything. He just sat with me in the quiet, and that quiet saved me. The host reached under the table again, carefully bringing out another envelope. This one was clearly older. The paper had yellowed with age. It was tied delicately with a thin piece of string. No markings, no stamps. Just an object that looked like it had waited decades to be opened. This arrived as well, the host said quietly. It came in a separate package, no return address, just a note that said, "Deliver when the time is right." He slid the envelope toward Keanu across the small table between them. Keanu stared at it. His hands moved slowly, gently removing the string, as though unwrapping a memory that might fall apart if touched too harshly. He opened the flap and pulled out a single piece of folded paper, delicate, clean, yet weathered in its own way. His eyes scanned it quickly and then again, more slowly. The same handwriting, the same feeling, the same unmistakable weight of something deeply personal. Keanu read the line aloud. Your silence was never empty. It was full of truth. He blinked, overwhelmed. That's him, he whispered. "That's his voice." His fingers curled around the note as he stood slowly from his seat. His gaze moved toward the final row of the studio and locked on the man who had been sitting there in stillness since the very beginning. No words passed between them, no gestures, just tears and recognition. Keanu stood with the letter still in his hand, his posture neither rigid nor dramatic, just still, like someone standing in the presence of something sacred. The air in the room had changed. It wasn't a studio anymore. It felt like a sacred meeting ground between who he had been and who he had become. The host said nothing. The audience made no sound. Even the lights above seemed to dim themselves with reverence. Keanu's eyes stayed fixed on the man in the back row. Though the lights didn't directly shine on him, his presence was no longer shadow. The shape of his shoulders, the slope of his chin, the white of his hair, these small details became anchors. Anchors in time, anchors in memory. Keanu spoke, his voice soft but unwavering. "I didn't know you were hurting," he said quietly. "I didn't know what you'd lost, but you gave me everything. And now I know you were carrying your grief while you carried me." The man in the back row didn't move. His hands remained folded, but there was something in his stillness that now spoke louder than movement ever could. Keanu took a step forward. "I never said thank you," he said, his voice catching. "But I've lived every day trying to be someone who deserves what you gave me." He looked down at the note again, reading the sentence one more time. "Your silence was never empty. It was full of truth." He nodded. "I didn't understand it then, but I do now. The silence wasn't nothing. It was everything. It was where I started to find myself." He looked back at the man, his voice growing even quieter. "You made me believe that my voice mattered, even before I ever learned how to use it." The host finally spoke, his voice a soft thread through the room. "Keanu, I think it's safe to say he's heard every word." Keanu slowly sat back down, the letter still held gently in his fingers. His head dipped slightly, as if overwhelmed not just by memory, but by the presence of the man who had always seen him without needing to speak a single word. The audience remained still, their emotion held in respectful quiet, because now they knew. They knew who the man in the last row was, and more importantly, they knew what he had done. Not with grand gestures, not with noise, but with presence, with unwavering presence. Keanu wiped a tear from his cheek and whispered one more sentence to the man who still had not spoken. "You gave me more than a lesson. You gave me a beginning." Keanu sat quietly for a moment longer, as if giving the air itself time to absorb what had just passed between him and the man in the shadows. Then, slowly, he placed the second letter beside the first on the table. Both papers, now side by side, carried decades between them, but shared a single voice. The host cleared his throat gently, not to interrupt, but to ground the space. "Keanu," he said, "these letters, this moment, they're more than just a reunion. They're a testimony to what it means when someone believes in you before the world ever does." Keanu nodded, the emotion thick in his eyes. He spoke without needing to search for the words. "Helm didn't just believe in me, he believed for me. When I couldn't see anything ahead, he held the light. Not in front of me, but beside me. He never dragged me forward. He just stood there until I took the step." The audience stirred, visibly moved by the quiet truth in his voice. "I used to think that man was just a teacher," Keanu said, "but now I understand. He was something else entirely. He was a guardian, a witness, a kind of quiet mirror that didn't reflect who I was, but who I could become." He turned again to the man in the final row. "I didn't need applause back then," he said softly. "I just needed one person to say, 'You're worth the space you take up.' And you said it, without ever having to speak it. The host added gently, "And you've lived your life carrying that message into every room you walk into." Keanu's voice cracked again. "I've spent years wondering if any of it mattered, the roles, the interviews, the fame. But right now I know. This is what matters. This man. This presence. This memory that never stopped shaping me, even when I didn't realize it." The silence in the room grew heavier, not oppressive, but holy. The camera panned once more to the back row. The man remained seated. Still no name, still no wave. But his eyes, now visible, glistened with the kind of still tears that come from love withheld for decades. And Keanu stood again. He didn't walk forward. He didn't reach out. He just placed one hand over his heart and bowed his head in the direction of the man. Nothing else was needed. No applause. No confirmation, because the truth was already known. This wasn't a chance meeting. This wasn't nostalgia. This was a life, recognizing its beginning. And two men, finally seen, finally understood, in the silence that had always spoken for them both. The room remained still. No movement, no sound. The two letters sat quietly on the table beside Keanu. The air felt thick with everything that had gone unsaid for years. Grief, gratitude, recognition. And then it happened. From the very back row, the figure slowly rose, not with theatrical flair, not with fanfare or expectation. He stood with quiet dignity. A simple action, but it rippled through the room like thunder beneath the skin. Keanu's eyes widened. He didn't speak. He didn't move. For a moment, it was as if his entire being had paused, stunned by the realization that the man he had been honoring all night wasn't just a memory in the shadows. He was real. He was here. The man took a single step forward, then another. His gait was slow, not from hesitation but from age. There was a purpose in his stride, a steady determination that required no explanation. Mr. Whitmore? No one needed to say his name. The air said it for them. Keanu stepped down from the stage, quietly, almost reverently. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He met Mr. Whitmore halfway, on the studio floor, right in the center of the room, where silence had spoken louder than any applause ever could. They stood face to face. Time fell away. And then Keanu reached forward. The embrace was long. No words were spoken. No cameras zoomed in. There was no music. Only presence. Keanu wrapped his arms around the man who had once sat beside him in silence. And now, decades later, that silence had bloomed into something neither of them could fully express. Mr. Whitmore held him with both arms, firm but trembling. When they finally stepped back, Keanu's eyes were glassy. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Mr. Whitmore, I've waited my whole life for this." Mr. Whitmore's voice, though older and worn, was steady and filled with warmth. "So have I." The audience didn't clap. They didn't need to. They just sat, honoring the moment with stillness. The host, watching from the stage, gave them space, before finally standing and speaking gently. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "would you join us?" The old teacher nodded and made his way toward the stage, Keanu walking beside him, with one hand lightly at his back. The two men sat down side by side, not as celebrity and guest, but as student and teacher, as boy and man, as two souls whose lives had remained bound across decades through a single, unwavering thread of quiet belief. Keanu turned to him and smiled, not the smile of fame, not the polished expression the world had seen 1,000 times, but the soft, vulnerable smile of a boy who had finally found his way back to where it all began. "Thank you," he said again, this time not just to be heard, but to be felt. Mr. Whitmore placed a hand over Keanu's and nodded. "And thank you," he replied, "for remembering." The host resumed his seat across from them, his demeanor respectful. his presence now more like that of a witness than a facilitator. The atmosphere in the studio was unlike anything it had been before. Less an interview, more a reunion, decades in the making. Keanu turned toward Mr. Whitmore, his voice still soft but steadier than before. "I always wondered if I'd imagined it," he said. "The way you treated me, the things you said. I thought maybe I'd made it more poetic in my memory, but being here with you now, it was real, wasn't it?" Mr. Whitmore smiled, eyes filled with both pride and something quieter, something more fragile. "It was real," he said. "Every moment of it. You may not have known it, but you were never just a student to me. You were a reason." Keanu's eyebrows drew in gently. "A reason?" The older man nodded. "I'd lost my wife. My world had gone silent. For the first time in my life, I questioned whether I could keep going, whether I even wanted to. And then you walked into my classroom. You didn't speak much, but your silence, it had weight. It had feeling. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten, how much it matters to stay." Keanu swallowed hard. "I thought I was just trying to survive," he said. "But you were doing the same." Mr. Whitmore nodded again. "And somehow we helped each other do it." The host asked gently, "Mr. Whitmore, what made you choose Keanu for that play?" The teacher smiled. "Because he didn't hide behind noise. Most students cover their fear with loudness, with distraction. But Keanu, he faced his silence head on. He didn't know it, but he had the kind of presence that couldn't be taught. It could only be honored." Keanu looked down for a moment, then back up. "I always wondered why. Why you saw something when I didn't even know what to look for." Mr. Whitmore answered softly. "Because I knew what it felt like to be lost. And I knew what it looked like to be found." The two sat in quiet recognition, the kind that only comes when years fall away and something deeper rises in their place. Keanu turned to the audience, not to perform, but to include them. "This man gave me the permission to be who I was before I had anything to offer the world. And that changed everything." He turned back to Mr. Whitmore. "You've been a part of every scene I've ever acted, even if no one could see it. Every time I've stood in front of a camera, I've heard your voice." Mr. Whitmore squeezed his hand gently. "And every time I saw you speak, every time I read about your kindness, I knew the boy I once taught had become the man he was always meant to be." No one spoke. No one needed to. Because in that moment, past and present finally touched. And the story was no longer just Keanu's. It was theirs. The studio lights stayed low. The silence in the room felt less like absence and more like reverence. Mr. Whitmore sat with his hands gently folded in his lap, his posture still dignified, still composed, though his eyes shimmered with unshed tears. He looked at Keanu, and his voice, though older, carried no weakness, only truth. "I lost my wife that year," he said. The words landed softly, but their weight was immense. Keanu's eyes widened slightly, even though he had just learned this moments earlier. "I was going to quit teaching," Mr. Whitmore continued. "I'd packed up my things, I had typed the letter of resignation. I told the principal I just needed to finish out the semester." He paused, glancing downward for a moment, then back up at Keanu. "And then you walked into my classroom." Keanu said nothing. His breath held in his chest. "You didn't say much at first," Mr. Whitmore said, "but I saw it. The pain behind your eyes, the questions you carried around like invisible bricks, the way you flinched when someone called your name too loudly. You weren't just a quiet kid, Keanu. You were a boy carrying a storm." The audience could be heard sniffling quietly, scattered tears falling across the room. "But even in that storm," Mr. Whitmore said, "I saw your light." Keanu looked like he was trying to hold himself together, but his lips trembled. The teacher reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, aged paper folded with care. He handed it to the host, who passed it to Keanu with both hands. It was the essay. The one Keanu had written all those years ago. Keanu stared at it, stunned. You kept this?" Matthews Whitmore smiled. "I kept everything." He reached into a small leather pouch resting by his chair and laid it on the table. Inside were a handful of items: the original cast photo from the school play, a few handwritten notes, a bookmark with a quote from Keanu's favorite novel, and a piece of notebook paper with one simple sentence written in a teenager's handwriting. "I don't know who I am, but I hope he's kind." Keanu's hand covered his mouth as emotion hit him full force. "I read that line," Mr. Whitmore said, "and I knew the world would need your voice one day, even if you didn't believe in it yet." Keanu blinked back tears, but he was losing the fight. "I was just trying to survive," he whispered. "You made me feel like I mattered. You made me believe I could be someone." Mr. Whitmore leaned forward, his eyes warm, filled with the kind of wisdom that only comes from loss, love, and long observation. "You already were, Keanu," he said gently. "You just hadn't seen it yet." Keanu nodded, no longer trying to wipe the tears away. He let them fall, because finally they were falling for the right reasons. The essay trembled slightly in Keanu's hands as he unfolded the paper and read the first few lines silently. His younger handwriting was uneven, hesitant. Every word on that page had once cost him everything to write. Now, decades later, those same words brought him back to the moment he first tried to explain himself to the world. "I remember writing this," he said quietly. "I didn't think anyone would even read it." "I read every word," Mr. Whitmore said, his voice firm, "and I saw in them something you didn't yet know how to name. Honesty. Pure, unfiltered honesty. You didn't write to impress. You wrote to survive. And that's the rarest kind of writing." Keanu looked back at him with an expression that was part wonder, part sorrow. "I've spent so much of my life trying to be enough," he admitted. "Enough for the world, enough for the people I've lost, enough for the ones who never stayed." Mr. Whitmore leaned closer and placed a gentle hand over Keanu's. "You were always enough," he said softly, "even when your voice shook, even when you couldn't finish your sentences, even when you believed you were invisible. You were seen." Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the words to sink into places that had remained closed for years. The host gave them a long pause, then asked, "Mr. Whitmore, did you ever expect to see him again?" The old man smiled gently. "No. I hoped, but I didn't expect. Some things in life are too beautiful to plan. You just have to be present when they arrive." Keanu looked out at the audience, his voice stronger now but filled with gratitude. "I've received awards," he said. "I've heard people cheer my name, but none of it compares to this. None of it means more than hearing the man who gave me a future say I was enough before I ever earned it." The audience began to cry openly now. Some dabbed their eyes, others simply let the tears fall, unashamed. They weren't watching a performance, they were witnessing healing. Mr. Whitmore turned to the host. "I've taught thousands of students," he said, "but there are some, you don't teach them, you walk beside them. And when you're lucky, one day, they turn around and recognize you." Keanu's voice broke again. "You didn't just walk beside me. You waited for me. You sat in the silence when no one else would." Mr. Whitmore nodded. "Because silence isn't absence, it's where truth gathers." Keanu turned back to him. "I don't know what the world thinks I am," he said, "but I know who I am sitting next to you. I'm still that boy, and I'm proud of him now." Mr. Whitmore squeezed his hand one last time, "And he should be proud of you too." The room remained hushed, wrapped in the weight of a moment that didn't need music, lights, or applause to make history. It had already done something greater. It had made two people whole. Mr. Whitmore reached into the same small leather pouch and pulled out a final envelope. It was thin, the paper yellowed by time, and sealed with a fold so gentle It looked like it had been reopened and refolded countless times. He looked at Keanu, his eyes soft but serious. "I wasn't sure when I'd give this back to you," he said. "I didn't know if I ever would. But I think today is the right day." Keanu accepted the envelope with both hands. There was reverence in how he handled it, like it was more than paper, like it was a piece of himself he had lost. He opened it slowly, carefully, and slid the page free. His eyes scanned the top, and his lips parted just slightly as he read the title aloud. "Where I Grow Up, I Want to Make Pain Smaller." A quiet gasp rolled across the audience. Some lowered their heads. Others placed hands over their hearts. Keanu looked down at the essay, then began to read. "I want to be someone who makes a room feel safer. Not by being big or loud or funny, but by listening. I think the world is too loud. People talk too much when they're scared. I want to be someone who hears the quiet things." He paused, and the paper trembled lightly in his fingers. "I want to be the kind of man who doesn't leave, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I want to be someone people remember when things fall apart, not because I fix them, but because I stay." He looked up briefly, his voice faltering, then returned to the page. "I think pain is like a hallway with no doors. I want to be a window, just one, so people know there's still a way out, or a way through." Keanu lowered the paper and took a breath that broke halfway through. He couldn't speak for a moment. The emotions caught up with him, wave after wave of realization, washing over years of silence and survival. Mr. Whitmore gently placed his hand on Keanu's back. "That," he said, "is the most honest thing I've ever read." Keanu shook his head slowly, a tear sliding down his cheek. "I thought I was just a broken kid trying to get through an assignment." "You were," Mr. Whitmore said, "and that's what made it true." The host leaned forward, visibly moved, and asked softly, "Mr. Whitmore, why did you keep it all these years?" The teacher smiled, not with nostalgia, but with certainty. "Because I knew," he said. "I knew the world would forget to listen, but one day someone would need to hear what that boy had to say. And when that moment came, I wanted him to remember who he really was." Keanu looked back at the page, his voice almost a whisper. "I've spent decades thinking I was just pretending to be strong, that every role I played was a mask." He turned to Mr. Whitmore, the boy inside him rising to the surface. "But I wasn't pretending, was I? I was trying to be this boy, the one who wrote this." Mr. Whitmore nodded slowly. "And you did. You became him." Keanu stared at the last line of the essay, as if seeing it for the first time. His voice cracked as he read it aloud. "I want to live in a way that makes other people believe kindness is still possible." The room sat in stunned silence. No applause, no sound, just the collective breath of hundreds of people who had just witnessed something sacred. Keanu folded the paper carefully and held it to his chest. He didn't speak right away. His body remained still, but his eyes glistened with memories and pain, hope and relief, all tangled together. "I wrote those words before I had anything," he finally said. "Before I had a name anyone knew. Before I had any confidence. I didn't even believe I'd make it to adulthood, let alone be heard." He looked over at Mr. Whitmore again, this time with open gratitude. "You believed in something I didn't know how to name. You saw that essay not as a cry for help, but as a seed." Mr. Whitmore nodded. "And I knew, even then, that seed would grow into something powerful." The host wiped his own eyes and asked gently, "Did you ever imagine, Mr. Whitmore, that this boy would become the Keanu Reeves the world knows today?" "I never imagined the fame," the teacher replied. "That part didn't matter to me. I imagined the man. I knew if he kept listening to that voice, the one that wrote this, then the world would be better because of him." Keanu shook his head slightly, overwhelmed. "I've done a lot of things in my life, some good, some not so good, but I've always tried to make the people around me feel safe. I've always tried to show up. I thought maybe it came from losing people, but now I know it came from this. From these words." Mr. Whitmore smiled again. "You didn't become a star, Keanu. You became what you wrote." Keanu closed his eyes at that. There was nothing more powerful than being told your truest self had been seen, not just once, but remembered. Not just remembered, but protected. "I thought I'd buried that boy," Keanu whispered. "I thought I had to become someone else to make it in this world." Mr. Whitmore's voice was strong, unwavering. "You didn't bury him, you carried him. Every step, every film, every quiet gesture. He was always there. You didn't change him, you honored him." The audience, no longer holding back, wept openly. The cameramen held steady, but even they had tears in their eyes. Keanu reached for the essay again and looked down at it one more time. "I wrote this thinking no one would ever care," he said. "And now, reading it out loud, I realize I've been living by it every day, not perfectly, but trying." Mr. Whitmore leaned closer. "And trying is enough. It always was." The essay rested between them like a bridge across time, proof that the smallest voice, once heard, could echo for a lifetime. And for the first time in years, Keanu didn't just feel remembered. He felt understood. Mr. Whitmore looked down for a moment, then reached once more into the pouch beside him. He pulled out a small, folded note. Not an essay this time, not an assignment. Just a memory he had written down long ago, to keep it from fading. "There's something else I've kept," he said, his voice quiet but filled with intention. Keanu turned toward him, curious. His body leaned forward slightly, instinctively reaching for whatever truth was coming. "It's not paper," Mr. Whitmore continued. "It's a moment, one I never told you I witnessed." Keanu blinked. "It was during a group reading assignment," the teacher said. "You had been around 15. Most of the students were gathered around in clusters, talking too loudly, half-heartedly reading lines." He looked directly at Keanu now. "But you were sitting in the corner of the room with Thomas." Keanu's brows pulled together. "Thomas? Thomas Breen." "He had cerebral palsy," Mr. Whitmore said. "He struggled to hold the book. He struggled even more to read aloud." There was a pause. "And you sat beside him. You turned the pages for him. You whispered every single line into his ear. You waited until he nodded before moving on. It took the entire period." Keanu's face was unreadable at first, as if he was reaching back into a fog of memories he hadn't visited in decades. The other students laughed. Not at him. "At you," Mr. Whitmore continued. "Because you didn't care about looking cool. You didn't care about how slow it was going. You just stayed." Keanu looked down slowly, his voice nearly silent. I don't remember that." Mr. Whitmore smiled, not in disappointment, but in understanding. "That's what made it beautiful," he said. "You weren't doing it for credit, you weren't trying to be seen, you were simply kind. And that kind of kindness," he added softly, "is the rarest." Keanu's hand instinctively pressed the essay against his chest again, like it was grounding him. "I always thought I was invisible back then," he said quietly. "I thought no one saw me. Not really." Mr. Whitmore shook his head, firm and gentle. "You were unforgettable." Keanu looked back up, visibly moved. Thomas, did he ever say anything about that day?" "Elle didn't need to," Mr. Whitmore replied. "But a week later, he started volunteering to read aloud more." He began raising his hand. "I don't think you knew it, but you unlocked something in him." Keanu's voice broke. "I was just trying to make him feel less alone." "And you did," Mr. Whitmore said. "In your silence, in your patience, you made the world safer for someone else." There was a long breath that passed between them. No performance, no pretense, just memory and truth finding their place. "You saw me before I could see myself," Keanu whispered. "And now the world sees you," Mr. Whitmore said softly. because of that truth. The audience once again fell into stillness, the kind of stillness that doesn't beg to be filled. Because in that moment, no applause was needed. Keanu hadn't just remembered who he was. He had remembered why. Keanu sat quietly, holding the weight of the moment. He leaned back slightly, his hands still resting over his chest, where the essay had pressed like an anchor to memory. His voice came softly. "I spent so many years trying to prove I deserved to be in the room," he said. "In film sets, interviews, life. I never realized. Maybe I was already there." Mr. Whitmore gave a knowing smile. "You were more than in the room, Keanu. You were shaping it." Keanu looked out toward the audience, as if seeing their faces for the first time. People who had followed his career, who had watched him on screens large and small, who admired his calmness, his mystery, his kindness, but who now saw something deeper. The thread of a boy trying to do something simple. Make pain smaller. "You told me once," Keanu said, turning to Mr. Whitmore, "that silence isn't emptiness. It's where truth gathers." Mr. Whitmore nodded. "I didn't understand that back then," Keanu continued, "but now I do. Silence gave me space to care without expectation, to listen without interrupting, to sit with someone else's pain without rushing in to fix it." Mr. Whitmore's eyes misted. "You weren't invisible, Keanu. You were present. There's a difference. Most people live their whole lives trying to be seen, but the rarest gift is being someone who sees others." Keanu's lips trembled. "And you saw me." "I did," Mr. Whitmore answered. "And not because you were loud or brilliant or dramatic. I saw you because your kindness didn't need an audience." Keanu turned toward him again. "Why didn't you tell me back then? About Thomas? About how you saw me?" The teacher gave a soft, almost apologetic smile. "Because I didn't want to break the spell. Some things grow better in the quiet. I wanted you to choose who you'd become, without the pressure of a label. I trusted that the boy who turned those pages for Thomas would turn his life into something meaningful. Because that's who he already was." Keanu looked at the floor, then back up. "I thought I was pretending to be a good person, but maybe I was just practicing." Mr. Whitmore reached out again and took his hand gently. "And practice becomes a life, Keanu. That's the miracle." The host stepped back slightly, giving them space, his own eyes red with emotion. "You said earlier you wanted to make pain smaller. That was the title of your essay. Do you think you've done that?" Keanu looked down at his lap for a long second. "I hope so," he said. "Not through speeches or gestures, but maybe, in the moments no one saw." Mr. Whitmore's voice was soft but steady. "Those are the only ones that matter." The audience didn't applaud. They breathed. They watched. They felt. In a world that celebrates loudness, this was something else. Two men sitting side by side, one remembering, the other reminding, and between them a truth carried for decades. The smallest acts, the quietest moments, are the ones that shape a life. Keanu sat back in his chair, the lights on stage gently softening, the moment stretching like an invisible thread between them. His eyes didn't leave Mr. Whitmore's. They were full of something deeper than curiosity, something close to aching. "Why now?" Keanu asked quietly. "Why did you wait all this time?" Mr. Whitmore didn't answer right away. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees as if measuring every word not with caution, but care. "Because you had to walk your own road," he finally said. "You needed time to become the man you were meant to be, and I needed to stay in the background long enough for that to happen." Keanu's brows furrowed gently. "But you saw everything. You kept all of it." The teacher reached down and pulled a small black notebook from his side. The leather was aged, worn at the corners, the pages inside slightly yellowed. "I kept this," Mr. Whitmore said, offering it to Keanu with both hands. Keanu took it slowly, his fingers tracing the cover like it was a sacred relic. He opened it, just a few pages at first. His breath caught in his throat. "This is my handwriting," he whispered. "From high school." He flipped further and the years seemed to collapse. There were sketches in the margins, lines of poetry, fragments of thoughts. One read, "I wish people understood silence isn't fear. It's a place I go when the noise gets too heavy." Keanu looked up, eyes wide. "I wrote this?" Mr. Whitmore nodded. "In 10th grade. I remember the exact day. It was after that argument in the cafeteria. You stayed after class and asked if I thought silence was weak. You didn't say much else. Just handed me this and walked out." Keanu flipped to the last page. It was dated a few months before he dropped out of high school. The words were scrawled but sincere. "I don't know where I'll end up, but I want to carry the quiet places with me." He closed the notebook carefully, both hands trembling slightly. "I forgot all of this. I forgot who I was." Mr. Whitmore's voice was gentle. "That's why I kept it. I knew one day you'd need to remember who you were before the world told you who to be." Keanu's eyes filled again, slower this time. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming collision of memory and identity. "I thought I became someone because I worked harder, tried harder, suffered longer. But maybe," he held up the notebook, "maybe I just needed to remember that I was already someone." "You were," Mr. Whitmore said. "You were someone before the cameras, before the scripts, before the audiences. You were someone when you were just a boy who sat in the back row and asked quiet questions." Keanu held the notebook against his chest. It felt like he was cradling a piece of himself, long buried, but still breathing. The studio had gone completely silent again. The audience didn't move. They were watching something rare. Not a performance, but a homecoming. Keanu leaned forward slightly. "You believed in that boy more than I did," Mr. Whitmore replied, "because I knew he was real, and I knew he'd return to himself when the time was right." Keanu slowly opened the notebook again. This time, he didn't read aloud. He simply let his eyes wander across the pages. The penmanship was uneven in places. Some words crossed out, others underlined 2 or 3 times, but it was all unmistakably him. Raw, unfiltered, young. He let out a breath that trembled slightly. "I used to write these things down because I didn't know how to say them out loud." Mr. Whitmore gave a soft smile. "And that's what made them honest." There was something profound in that notebook. Not just the writings, but the untouched sincerity they carried. Keanu could see the boy he once was in every line. Not an actor, not a celebrity. Just a kid trying to find shape in a world that made him feel invisible. He looked at Mr. Whitmore again. "You didn't just save me back then. You saved this version of me. You held on to the part of me that I lost along the way." "I didn't save it," Mr. Whitmore said gently. "I honored it. There's a difference." Keanu nodded, then looked out into the silent crowd. "We talk so much about growth," he said softly, "about evolving, becoming better, stronger, wiser. But sometimes the bravest thing we can do is look back and say, that scared, quiet version of me mattered too." The host, standing just a few feet away, was visibly moved but chose not to interrupt. The moment was still unfolding, alive with reflection. Mr. Whitmore leaned forward. "That boy wrote about making pain smaller, about carrying the quiet places. You didn't grow out of him, Keanu. You grew around him. He's still there." Keanu touched the edge of the notebook again. "That boy was always afraid he wouldn't matter." Mr. Whitmore nodded, and he was wrong. Keanu's eyes softened with gratitude, but also with realization. "Do you know what this means to me? That you kept this? That you waited until now? The teacher looked at him, eyes steady. I waited because I wanted to give it back to you when it would mean the most, not when you were winning awards, not when the world was cheering, but when you were asking real questions about who you are. That's when it counts. Keanu nodded slowly. That's now. The air around them was still charged, but quieter than before. The emotion hadn't faded, it had deepened. The audience wasn't watching a reunion anymore. They were watching a man touch the soul of his former self. Keanu looked down at the black notebook one last time and then closed it carefully. This is me, he whispered again, voice steady now. Mr. Whitmore smiled. It always was. They sat in silence, not because there was nothing left to say, but because some moments don't require more words. They require presence, reflection, reverence. In that pause, the weight of time settled into something sacred. A teacher and a student, a boy and a man, a past and a present, finally in the same room. And for the first time in years, Keanu didn't feel like he was chasing meaning. He was holding it. Mr. Whitmore glanced down at his lap, where his hand rested gently on the edge of the black notebook. His voice, when it returned, was clear but full of feeling. There's something I need to tell you, he said, turning to Keanu. This is my last year teaching. I'm retiring. Keanu blinked, caught off guard. You are? The teacher nodded. 42 years in the classroom. It's time. A hush settled over the audience again. There was something solemn about the moment, but also celebratory. A lifetime of shaping minds, of planting seeds, and now a final chapter. Mr. Whitmore lifted the notebook once more and placed it back into Keanu's hands. I've held on to this longer than I ever imagined, but I always knew it wasn't mine to keep. It was waiting for the right moment. To go home. Keanu accepted it with both hands, reverently. You're giving this to me? I'm passing it on, Mr. Whitmore replied. And with it, a wish. Keanu leaned in slightly, listening. I want you to let your story help others, the teacher said. Not just through your films or your fame, but through your truth. That boy in those pages, the one who felt invisible, who wrote from a place of pain, there are thousands more just like him, maybe millions. And they're waiting to hear that it's okay to be who they are. Keanu nodded, his eyes clouding again. You want me to carry the quiet places? Mr. Whitmore smiled. Yes, let the silence you once carried become someone else's courage. Keanu looked down at the notebook again. It no longer felt like a journal from the past. It felt like a mission. I don't want this just to be a memory, he said softly. I want it to matter. The host stepped forward slightly, sensing something was shifting. Keanu, he said, what would that look like? Keanu thought for a moment, then turned to Mr. Whitmore with a resolve in his voice that hadn't been there before. We want to start a scholarship, he said. In your name. The audience drew in a breath. Keanu continued, for students who feel forgotten, who don't fit into the usual boxes, who need someone to see them before they can see themselves. Mr. Whitmore's lips trembled. He covered his mouth for a moment, then let his hand fall away. You would do that? He asked. I have to, Keanu replied. Because you didn't just help me survive school, you helped me survive myself. And I know there are kids out there right now wondering if they matter. I want them to know they do. The host's voice was full of emotion. Do you want to name it now? Keanu turned to the audience, then back to Mr. Whitmore. The Whitmore Legacy Scholarship, he said. Applause began softly, but built slowly. Steady, not loud. The kind that came from hearts, not hands, from gratitude, not routine. Mr. Whitmore's shoulders shook. He wiped at his eyes, then reached out to clasp Keanu's hand. You've done more than repay the gift, he whispered. You've multiplied it. Keanu looked back at him, his expression full of reverence. "I was just trying to become the man you believed I could be." The applause faded slowly, leaving behind an atmosphere charged with something deeper than celebration. It was reverence. The kind that only surfaces when people witness something that touches truth. Keanu looked down at their joined hands, then gently squeezed Mr. Whitmore's fingers. "You don't know how many times I doubted myself," Keanu said softly. "Even long after the cameras came. Even when people called me successful. But this moment makes all those quiet pieces inside me feel seen again." Mr. Whitmore smiled. "You never stopped being that boy. You just learned how to carry him with more grace." The host stepped back slightly, allowing the two to remain center stage. The camera crews had stopped cutting to reaction shots. They let the silence breathe. The moment didn't need edits. It needed space. Keanu sat forward and opened the notebook once more. He thumbed through the pages, letting the old paper whisper its history into the room. There was a drawing of a tree with roots curling deep below. There were lines of poetry written in sharp, urgent pen strokes. One page simply said, "One day I want to matter, even if it's just to one person." He turned that page slowly, hands steady now. "You mattered," Mr. Whitmore said, his voice slightly breaking, "to more than you'll ever know." Keanu nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Then I want this scholarship to carry that forward, not just for those who excel, but for the ones who are still trying to believe they deserve a chance." The host, voice now quiet and sincere, asked, "What would you tell the first student who receives it?" Keanu didn't hesitate. "I'd tell them, your silence isn't a weakness, it's a language, and the world needs what only you can say in it." Mr. Whitmore beamed, but his eyes were full again. "You didn't just find your voice, Keanu. You gave it a purpose." Keanu turned slightly toward the audience. "We talk so much about success, about standing out. But what saved me wasn't being special, it was being seen. Just once, by one man. And that changed everything." The audience sat in stillness. Many wiped away tears. Some simply held their hands over their hearts. Mr. Whitmore reached for the notebook again, but paused. Instead, he placed his palm over Keanu's. "This isn't just yours," he said. "It's theirs now, every page, every word. Let it go where it's needed most." Keanu closed his eyes briefly, nodding. "It will." Then, with no cue, no production prompt, the studio lights dimmed slightly, not for drama, but to match the intimacy of the moment. It was as if the whole room was exhaling together. The host stepped forward once more. This episode was meant to reflect on legacy, and tonight we've seen what it looks like in its purest form. Keanu looked at Mr. Whitmore. "You were never just a teacher." Mr. Whitmore smiled through his tears. "And you were never just a student. You were always becoming someone who would teach the world something far more important than lines on a page." As the final word settled into silence, the two sat side by side, holding the past between them, not as something to mourn, but something to give away. And in that stillness, a legacy was passed. Not through applause or recognition, but through quiet understanding, carried forward in every story yet to be written. The room had grown still again, like the pause between heartbeats. Keanu thought the moment had reached its end, but Mr. Whitmore shifted in his seat and reached into the inside pocket of his coat. His fingers moved slowly, with purpose. He pulled out a small bundle, carefully wrapped in soft white tissue, yellowed at the edges. Keanu watched, puzzled, as the teacher gently unwrapped the layers to reveal a single, folded sheet of paper. The creases were deep, the ink slightly faded. Mr. Whitmore held it as if it were sacred. "I've carried this for a long time," he said. Keanu leaned forward. "What is it?" Mr. Whitmore looked at the paper before placing it in Keanu's hands. "A letter. from you. One you never mailed." Keanu blinked, stunned. "What?" "You wrote it near the end of your senior year," Mr. Whitmore said. "I found it tucked inside one of the drawers in my classroom. I think you planned to give it to me, but something changed. Maybe you got busy, maybe you second-guessed yourself, but you left it behind." Keanu stared at the folded sheet as if it might disappear if he blinked. "You kept it?" Mr. Whitmore nodded. "I read it once, then I wrapped it and put it away. I told myself I'd only return it when the time was right." Keanu took a breath and began unfolding the note. His hands moved more slowly than usual, as if opening it would peel back time itself. When the page was finally flat in his lap, he looked down at the writing. The words were messy but unmistakably his. "Dear Mr. Whitmore, I don't know how to say this without it sounding dramatic, but you saved me. Not by doing something big, by doing 100 small things I'll never forget. You showed up. You stayed. You listened. You saw me. When I walked into your class, I didn't think I belonged anywhere. But you made that room feel like a place where I could breathe. If I ever become someone, it will be because of how you made me feel. Like I wasn't broken, just becoming. Thank you. I hope you know you changed my life." Keanu's lips moved silently as he read the lines. By the time he reached the last sentence, his shoulders trembled. He pressed the letter to his chest, then looked back up at Mr. Whitmore. "I don't remember writing this," he said quietly, "but I meant every word." The teacher's eyes glistened. Even unsent, it mattered. Keanu gave a soft, almost trembling laugh. "I was so scared back then, of being too much or not enough. This was the best I could do." Mr. Whitmore leaned forward. "It was more than enough. It was honest, and sometimes the words we never speak are still heard by the people who matter." The studio remained silent. The host didn't interrupt. The cameras didn't zoom. It was as if time had stopped to make room for something sacred. Keanu looked down at the letter again. Then he folded it carefully, pressing each line with his fingers. He didn't put it back in the tissue. He held it openly in his hands, like a bridge between who he was and who he had become. "I never mailed this," he said softly, his voice steady now. "But now, I get to say it in person." He stood slowly and walked toward Mr. Whitmore, the folded letter still held tight in his grip. As Keanu reached him, Mr. Whitmore stood as well. Their eyes locked. Student and teacher, separated by time but bound by something deeper than memory. Keanu didn't hesitate. He pulled Mr. Whitmore into a hug, the letter still pressed between them like a sealed truth finally opened. The room remained silent, not out of instruction, but instinct. No one clapped, no one whispered. It was a moment meant to be witnessed, not disturbed. They stayed like that for a long time. When they finally pulled apart, Keanu kept his hand on Mr. Whitmore's shoulder. "Thank you," he said, his voice calm but rich with emotion, "for carrying that letter when I couldn't." Mr. Whitmore's eyes were red but clear. "And thank you for living the kind of life that proved every word in it true." Keanu glanced down at the folded note in his hand. "You know, when I wrote this, I didn't believe I had much of a future. I didn't know if I'd make it to 25. But I wanted you to know you mattered to me, even if I never got the chance to say it." Mr. Whitmore gave a soft smile. "You just did." They returned to their seats, side by side, the air between them now filled with something unspoken, and yet completely understood. Keanu laid the letter gently on the table in front of them. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was a mirror of who he was, and a bridge to who he became. The host finally spoke, softly. "There are many kinds of fame, but this, What we've seen tonight, this is the rarest kind." Keanu nodded, but his gaze stayed on Mr. Whitmore. "We spend so much of our lives chasing approval, but the most powerful moments aren't loud. They're like this, quiet, steady, unforgettable." Mr. Whitmore chuckled gently. "It's strange, isn't it, how a small act, an unsent letter, a seat beside a lonely student, can ripple across decades." Keanu replied, "That's what grace is. It moves through silence, through what isn't said, but always felt." The host leaned forward. "If you could go back to that moment in your classroom, just for 1 minute, what would you tell your younger self?" Keanu paused. Then he answered, slowly, "I'd say, don't rush to be strong. Let yourself feel. Let people see you. You're not alone." Mr. Whitmore reached for the letter again, but instead of picking it up, he rested his hand over it. "And I'd tell him, one day, you'll be the reason someone else makes it through their darkness." Keanu looked at him, eyes full. "You already were mine." The teacher smiled, a smile that carried both the pride of a mentor and the peace of a man who had given his greatest gift and watched it bloom. As the studio lights softened, the letter between them seemed to glow, not with spectacle, but with meaning. And in that stillness, the unsent words had finally found their way home. 1 year later, the sky over Los Angeles was soft with early morning light as Keanu Reeves walked alone through the gates of his old high school. The building looked smaller now, but the feelings it stirred in him had only grown. He carried something carefully in his hand, a single framed page wrapped in cloth. The hallways were quiet, no film crews, no crowd, just polished floors, faded lockers, and memories. Keanu walked past the science wing, past the old gym, until he reached the literature room. The same wooden door, the same golden plaque above it. But now, there was something new beside it, a portrait. It was simple, black and white, Mr. Whitmore seated in his classroom, mid-sentence, a half-smile on his face and a book open in his lap. Underneath it, in clean serif letters, read, "In honor of Edward Whitmore, the teacher who listened." Keanu paused for a long time before he unwrapped the item in his hands. It was the essay, the one he'd written decades ago, the one Mr. Whitmore had saved. It was now preserved behind museum-grade glass in a wooden frame. He bent down, opened the small display stand beneath the portrait, and placed the essay inside with care. As he stood up again, he rested his hand gently on the wood. Then he spoke softly, more to the air than to anyone nearby. "You never asked for thanks, you just stayed, you just believed." The corridor held its breath. No sound, just presence. That afternoon, Keanu stepped onto the small stage inside the school auditorium. Rows of students, parents, teachers, and guests filled the seats. A banner stretched across the back wall. The Whitmore Scholarship Foundation, for students who feel unseen. Keanu approached the microphone not as a celebrity, but as a grateful student returning home. He looked out over the crowd, then back at the first row, where a group of literature teachers sat quietly with their hands folded. One of them wore Mr. Whitmore's old watch, gifted by Keanu at the teacher's memorial. He cleared his throat and began, "Where I was 15, I had a teacher who sat beside me in silence. That might not sound extraordinary, but when you're a kid who feels like he's fading into the background, having someone sit beside you without trying to fix you, that's everything." The room was still. Hell didn't make speeches. He didn't demand I change. He just noticed. And sometimes, being noticed with kindness is enough to change a life. Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black notebook, the one Mr. Whitmore had saved for decades. He held it up. "These are the words I wrote before I knew who I was, and they survived because someone believed they were worth keeping." He set the notebook on the podium, let his hands rest at his sides, and looked again at the students. "If there's someone who saved you with their belief, find them, thank them, or be that person for someone else. The silence was powerful, not empty, full. After the ceremony, students and guests came up one by one to thank Keanu. Some spoke about teachers who had believed in them. Others admitted they hadn't had one yet, but hoped to become that person for someone else someday. One teenage boy approached with his mother. He looked nervous but determined. "I didn't think I mattered," the boy said, his voice quiet. "But after today, I think I might." Keanu knelt to eye level and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You do," he said. "You always did. Sometimes it just takes one person to help you see it." The boy smiled through tears. His mother squeezed Keanu's hand, mouthing a silent "thank you." Later that evening, the sun dipped behind the school's brick walls, casting golden light across the courtyard. Keanu walked alone once more, retracing the hallway that led back to Mr. Whitmore's portrait. He stopped and stared at it again. In the framed essay below, a single sentence glowed faintly in the fading light. "When I grow up, I want to make pain smaller." Keanu nodded. He turned to leave, but paused one last time. Voiceover. "Schultz taught me that you don't need to be loud to matter. You just need to believe in someone quietly." The screen faded to black. Then, a final message appeared in white text. If you've ever had a teacher who changed your life, drop their name in the comments. Let the world know they mattered. And if you believe one act of kindness can last a lifetime, hit like, subscribe, and share this incredible story.